So as our amazing panel makes their way to the stage, I want to get us in the frame of mind for this closing plenary session. What does philanthropy need to do differently to shift power to marginalized communities, right? It's a pretty important question. And we've been talking about power all week. And so in this session, it's time to get real about, like, what are you going to do next week, next month, during the next year to build power, to shift power to marginalized communities? What can you do? How can NFG support you in doing that? For those of you who don't know me, I'm Aaron Dorfman. I'm the Executive Director of the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. Thank you. I'm supposed to be channeling my inner Phil Donahue today, so I'm going to be roving around, getting thoughts from everyone in this room, as well as getting thoughts from our illustrious panel. You know, we all know what some of the good grant-making practices are, right? Multi-year funding, general operating support, but we don't always do those things, even ourselves, let alone our colleagues who might not agree that those are the right things. So we're going to talk about what are some of those good practices, but I want to start things out by turning to our panel and having them share with us their thinking about what does shifting power really mean, and what do we really mean when we talk about marginalized communities. I should say, too, that we have a last-minute substitution on our panel. Thank you to Laine Romero-Alston from the Ford Foundation, who has graciously agreed to step in for Charisse West Scantleberry, who could not make it. Next to Laine is Fred Blackwell of the San Francisco Foundation. Next to Fred is Patty Castellanos from Laine in Los Angeles. And on the far left, Rashad Robinson from colorofchange.org. Or maybe the far right, depending on which way you're looking at it. So let me turn it over to you guys. What do you mean by shifting power? What do we mean by marginalized communities?
The Ford Foundation to the left, and actually let it start over there.
Well, that wasn't really shifting power.
Touche.
The Ford Foundation said go first. Okay, so I want to talk about this in terms of my organization, Color of Change, and sort of how we operationalize and think about power every single day in terms of how we do our work. We were founded in the aftermath of a flood that was caused by bad decision makers, Hurricane Katrina, that turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. Black people were on their roofs, literally begging for the government to do something, and nothing happened. In so many ways, it really not only helped us tell a story, or amplified a story of systemic racism, of the impact of generational poverty and climate change, and the ways in which race and class plays a role in those things. But it also amplified and created visibility around a movement challenge that nobody was disappointed. I mean, nobody was nervous about disappointing Black people. Government, institutions, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. And when no one is nervous about disappointing your community, when no one has urgency about disappointing your community, you don't have power. You're not able to shift power. You're not able to leverage the classic tools of policy, of telling stories, when in fact, the decision makers don't have incentive to do anything for you. to respond to your needs and your concerns. And so for us at Color of Change, while we saw many great speeches in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, we saw people with empathy, we saw shout outs from the stage, we saw all these things, but empathy alone will not actually change conditions. People feeling sorry for you will get you millions of dollars to the Red Cross, and the Red Cross not actually feeling that they have to actually build anyone's homes in New Orleans or the Gulf Coast. And so how do you actually think about shifting power? And so I've spent the last 5 years at Color of Change as executive director. And before that, I was a leader inside of GLAAD, which is a big national LGBT organization. Leadership is often very white, cis male identified. And so I've walked into many of the same corporations representing GLAAD and representing Color of Change. And I've experienced the difference between people being nervous about disappointing your community and people not being nervous about disappointing your community. And that doesn't mean that gay folks are not marginalized, right? It does mean, though, that we have to have a real accurate conversation around what marginalized look like, and we can't be sort of sloppy and paint large sort of swaths around what marginalized looks like, because then we actually make the wrong decisions about who we resource, who we empower, and how we resource those movements to not just be present, but to be powerful. And that's the final sort of thing I want to talk about, is that at Color of Change, we talk a lot about it. If anyone has heard me talk, you've heard me talk about the difference between presence and power. And so often, throughout my time at Color of Change, I've been working to ensure that funders, that our members, that our board, that folks who work with us, we translate and work to think about how do we translate Black folks to not just be present in the world, but to be powerful. How do we not think about symbols as sort of the end result of where we power? We're about to end the sort of time of the first Black president, the 8 years of the first Black president, and symbols are important. It is important at times to see the first Black family in the White House. But that does not change our ability to shift written or unwritten rules, to shift the unwritten rules of culture, to shift the written rules of policy. And sometimes when we pay attention to just symbols, when we pay attention to just presence, then we actually learn and do the wrong things, and it can actually work against us to be able to shift power. Some examples of that, we're seeing this media context right now around Donald Trump. And so we've really thought about through our campaign work. And so later today, the RNC will have to make some announcements around the fact that they're gonna have a pretty big budget shortfall because of the campaign that the Color of Change Super PAC has been running for state corporations. I'm not gonna name the corporations because Bloomberg and New York Times are about to, and I promised them exclusives. But I will say that we started these conversations going into rooms where folks tried to have a conversation with us about supporting both sides. We give a little to the left. We give a little to the left, and we give a little to the right. And you know, this is about civic engagement, and Trump is not that bad. And we kept pushing. And it wasn't just about Black people and Black organizations, but about building a multiracial, multi-gender coalition of organizations that would join us in this effort. Hundreds of thousands of people have signed petitions, but we've also spent a lot of time behind the scenes. We've delivered those petitions. We've called on shareholders. We've done research behind the scenes on their executives and put them front and center in our conversation. And so at the end of the day, it wasn't simply about making speeches or demand. And so 10 years later, as we work to force people to have to respond differently, the work still is really about how do you translate the presence of the issues we care about into the power to get things done? How do you force institutions and government to be nervous about disappointing your community? And how do we resource institutions to not just respond after the fact, but to have the type of infrastructure that can build the power, hold institutions accountable, and show up into rooms the way that I was able to show up at GLAAD? With the understanding that those corporations not just had to listen to us because we could put out a press release, but because we could run a year-long campaign. or we could run a 2-year-long campaign. So I want to end there.
Awesome.
Good morning or afternoon. Where are we? Afternoon. Okay. So I was actually thinking about this for many days, of course, but especially on the ride over from LA this morning, and thinking about this notion of shifting power and realizing how mild it sounds in comparison to what it actually is. And I think you all know it, and also I do feel like I'm, talking about some of the basics that you all know, but this concept of shifting power is not at all as mild as it sounds, and it's quite radical, quite revolutionary, and I think all of our communities feel that every day. And it is, I say mild because the shifting of power, it's a contest for power. We are getting our communities, low-income communities, immigrant communities, Black communities in LA, marginalized communities and workers into rooms, into decisions where they are not wanted, where we are not wanted. And as Rashad said, part of the task for us and our goal is to own those places, to, as John Powell this morning said, like to walk into a room and feel like we belong, feel as entitled as those power structures that currently exist feel entitled to their power. We need to feel as entitled to that same power. And so what I wanted to talk about just briefly is that this, the shifting of power is not always pretty, it's not always sexy. There are many very boring meetings, as you all know. There are a few requirements, at least from Laine's perspective, from my perspective, that I don't think are new to anyone in this room, which is really, it requires deep organizing in those communities, struggle alongside those communities for change, and in those communities that are most impacted by the problems that exist in our communities, right? So it is not my job as an organizer, as an advocate, to advocate on behalf of marginalized communities. It is our job together alongside with those communities to fight for that power, and we do that every day, and it is a risk for those people, and I think this is the thing to understand. Those communities that are involved in shifting power, they risk their livelihood. When a worker takes on their boss because they've been the victims of wage theft, that is not something easy. For them, it is life-changing, but the process of getting them there speaks to a level of power that they've now felt to demand to be treated equally, to demand to be treated with respect and dignity. And I think our communities, as well as these workers, do that every day, and it's a long process. It's a scary process for them to get there. The other requirement for us is working with allies that with which we share common cause, and struggling and fighting together, and acknowledging that not one of our organizations is able to do this alone. And that takes a lot, especially it's in the context of seeking funding for our work. That it means a lot, so that we are not in competition with each other, but we're in fact collaborating on all fronts to seek the change that we want. The other, I think has been spoken to, is really pulling on the various different levers. There is not one tool that gets us to success. There is not one tool that gets us to victory. We have to fight on the policy front. We have to organize. We have to do intense, meaningful research. We have to do incredible communications. We have to play on all these various fields to really win. And then I think the other not more important, but other acknowledgement is that this is a very, very long process. And, in LA, the story of change in LA, the story of our contest for power in LA is a 20-year story, at least, right? So there was not a very short campaign to turn and shift power in LA the way that we've successfully done. Shifting that power was one thing. 20 years later, it's our job, and equally difficult, to hold on to that power, right? And to make sure that we're continually electing progressive elected officials, passing progressive policy, and really continuing to move the ball. And that just reminds me one of the things I wanted to say at the beginning is that all of this is in the context of, and again, John Powell's keynote this morning was important grounding in our values, right? We are not shifting power for the sake of shifting power. And I think it's important, although, again, very basic, to be explicit about that, because when we are, and as most of our organizations and the groups that you fund are, we have an inside and an outside strategy, and we come into circles where there is a contest for power for the sake of power. And I think it's easy to lose the fact that we are actually fighting to advance values of inclusivity, of equity, of justice. And it's important for us to remind, ourselves that we're doing that, because power is also very seductive. And so when you enter those rooms of power, you can see oh yeah, this is a really fun game, but it's really important for us to ground ourselves in what it means for us and what it means for our communities and who's alongside us in these struggles for power. And so, again, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I really look forward to engaging in the discussion some more.
So first, I'd just like to thank neighborhood funders for putting the power discussion front and center and kind of putting the people, place, and power frame on the equity agenda. We just this week announced a similar frame, and actually the exact same frame for how we are going to be approaching our grant making. So I feel like I'm in the right room. You both kind of, I think, put it very well, so I don't want to repeat any of the things that you guys said. But I guess what I would add to the conversation is that I've spent probably the most significant part of my career in local government, both here in Oakland and in San Francisco. And one of the things that I was always struck by was the fact that whether it was where's the stop sign going to be, or where are we going to put the traffic light, or which pothole is going to be filled, or which development project is going to be approved, or where's the dog park going to go, heaven forbid, who's going to get a bike lane. Just the small number of people who were designing the solutions, impacting the decision making, being the decision makers, and what that meant for the folks who didn't have the ability to be in that room and influence those decisions. And so for me, shifting power really it covers a broad spectrum of activities, from who gets elected to how they're elected, to who gets to be in the room when the solutions are designed, and how decisions can be influenced before people get there 2 or 3 minutes at the microphone at the public meeting where the decision's likely already been made already. And so for me, what that means is a shifting of the way and the values that we have around power and how people exercise it. I think it also very much, corresponds with Rashad, what you were saying, which is the shift from presence to power. And so those are all things that come to mind for me. And then when I think about marginalized communities and what that means for me, what comes to mind is that one, the community part of that can be different. It can be a community of race or ethnicity, a community of affinity or geography. But for any one of those, what it means to be marginalized is that whether it's intentional or not, or has intent associated with it, it's about really your voice being undermined by structures of power, and the result of that being poor outcomes for you, individuals in that community, or families in that community. And so that can be different from one community to the next. It can be different from one neighborhood or city to the next. But to me, that's a kind of core element of the kind of thought about being marginalized and what that means and who needs to be thought about and focused on when we think about shifting the power.
Thank you. Man, I get the microphone and I get the 1 minute sign. Okay, that's power. Now,
That's what happens when you give your power up.
well, that's what I was going to say. I was going to actually, I went to I went to a session right before this that was about funding social movements, and we had really, really, I think, important conversations that were about this. And I think I think the way in which you all talked about this, I think, is right on. And the conversation we had yesterday with our plenary, that was really, really getting at both sort of some definitions, but also some tensions around how do we think about power, economic power, political power, cultural power, and what are we meaning in terms of what's our end goal with that. But I want to talk about the role and relationship of philanthropy empowering and our role in shifting power. And the first, I think, is to recognize that power exists, right? It exists. And then what do we do with that? As a white woman who sits at Ford, if, by the way, you didn't know, is the second largest philanthropic organization in the world, boom, who then says, I'll shift power to the left, right? And the ability then to say, yes, that's shifting power, Laine, or not, right? And so what's our role in relationship, and what do we do with this, right? And I think it's easy for us, I think there's a lot of things that we're trying to do systemically in the way in which philanthropy relates to our foundations, and I'm really proud to be at Ford at this moment. I think where the institution, and particularly Darren, is taking really important, courageous steps to try to shift the relationship of a foundation like Ford to a field, both in philanthropy and challenging philanthropy in our ways as well as our grantees. And do I think I think it will have impact? Do I think it addresses fully does it fully shift power dynamics? No, it'll contribute, and I think it's important. But I think something that Charles Field said this morning when he was talking about recognizing the way in which power plays out, both in terms of the ways in which it limits our ability to meet our common goals for liberation, social justice, and the way in which it plays out in each of our roles as a program officer in relationship to our grantees, as a program officer in relationship to our VPs, as a program officer at Ford in relationship to my colleagues in philanthropy, and how do we really grapple with how do we reorganize this power? How do we utilize the power we each have to the edges, to the utmost edges we can, and also be strategic. And Charles, I really appreciate if you're here, your conversation of what did that look like within your institution as a program officer to take accountability and responsibility for the privilege of the movement function we are playing as part of a field, as part of an ecosystem that sits here, that the responsibility that we have to take risk, to push, to move our institutions, and to move as much resources as we can to shifting power. And there are limitations. What is the battle? What is the battle to transform that in an individual? So we can think about Kwong from Chorus Foundation today asked a question of what facilitates creating trust between someone in philanthropy and someone who is in a grantee relationship, and what prohibits that? Concretely, that's the individual relationship. I can do a lot there, and I can feel great about it, or I can feel shitty about it. And then what is it that contributes institutionally, right, between that dynamics? And what contributes or prohibits in a field? And how are we intervening at each level? And where are our battles, right? Where are our battles there? As an organizer, that I am an organizer for social justice that sits within philanthropy for this moment, right? And how do I really grapple with that? Recognizing that I have power, that you have power, that you have power, and how do we transform that and be super honest? And I think this is, Rashad, this is awesome. To be honest with you, you have to both be vulnerable and open and listening, but also recognize that it's also this sort of deferential listening, I'll pass to the left. Sometimes that's not called for, and that does not shift power. Sometimes there's a way in which we actually have to step into our power, not be paralyzed, Charles, as you talked about, step into it, but share it in an intentional way, in a strategic way.
Thank you. So, I want to know what y'all thought of that. What's something that resonated with you, or something that was missing from this conversation? All right, Ed.
Just the conversation of the acknowledgement of these powers. I think this has really been a powerful theme, right? But we just had a webinar on Black Power and celebrating the 50th anniversary of the term Black Power, which is technically today. So for us to have this conversation here really resonates. In Oakland, the home of the Black Panther Party, celebrating 50 years, and still grappling with what it really means. And as we talk about Black Power, and as we talk about philanthropy and supporting marginalized communities, a phrase that was used earlier in the webinar was philanthropic redlining. I wish I had made it, but I think it really elevates the conversation that we really need to broach honestly on how we really get to the solutions around getting beyond the power and getting to making powerful contributions to help people, the people that we say we are committed to.
Thank you. Great. One more. What resonated, or what did we miss in this initial section? Somebody on this side of the room? Anything resonate from you? All right. Cool. So,
There's Laura.
All right. Good.
I was just musing on several things related, thinking about the call to for transformation and real radical imagination about what the world could be and what we really might achieve if we got out of the pecan factory, as Maria talked about in our first plenary. For those who weren't there, she was talking about a person who worked in a pecan factory, and what did they dream of? And the answer was pecans, not flying. And so thinking about power, the reason that we're talking about it is because the way power is expressed is power over, right? And to have liberation, we need to end that. The question that I have, this is really a question and half-formed thought, is there a way to create power that is powerful for all beings and not a power over? I don't know, and what would that look like?
Awesome. Great question. All right, now I want you guys to get out your cell phones. We're going to do a little cell phone polling. So our first question is about how much of your portfolio, of your grant dollars in your portfolio, is intended to benefit marginalized communities or is benefiting marginalized communities. If it's less than 25%, you hit A and hit send. If you, et cetera. You see the choices up there. You just one letter in the content field. Ooh, wow, we got a room of superstars. A lot of 100% in the room. Andrea doesn't believe it. She thinks you're all liars.
Well, I think that a lot of us think we are funding marginalized communities, but when we talk to those marginalized communities, they're too small, they don't have audits, they haven't been around for 2 years, and yeah, we're not funding them. We're funding institutions.
All right, little truth telling here. Okay, did everybody get a chance to vote on this one? Looks like our final numbers are most people in the 75 to 100% bracket of their own portfolio. Okay, next slide. Next question is about your foundation or your institution as a whole. What percentage of grant dollars do you think is benefiting marginalized communities? Yeah, intended, right, or is actually benefiting. Those are two.
Oh, I was just saying intended is different than actual.
Yeah. Intending to benefit marginalized communities is different than actually benefiting those communities. Great point. All right, people are still voting on this one. Kevin, what did you put down for your answer on this one?
E, of course.
All right, 100% from the New York Foundation is intended to benefit marginalized communities.
I mean, I think there's various roles that different funders play. I mean, our role in New York is a funder of grassroots startup organizations, and our money goes to that. But then there's also pieces of other people's work that go towards some of the capacity building or the other pieces that help support the work. So it's not directly necessarily going to communities to do the organizing work, but it might be going towards building the institutions and supporting the development of institutions through board development or staff development or other things.
Cool. Cool, great point. All right, so our institutions as a whole not scoring quite as well. Now we want to talk about shifting power though. How much of our money is really about shifting power? Not just benefiting those communities, but shifting power to correct imbalances of power. Again, first question is around your own portfolio. What percentage is about shifting power? Okay, looks like everybody has voted. A much more even distribution. 34% of us in the room think less than half our dollars from our portfolios are shifting power. That's interesting. Next question is your institution as a whole. How much is your institution devoted to shifting power, correcting imbalances of power? Can we put the next poll up? There we go. Angela, what's your answer going to be?
Because a sizable share is going directly to community organizing, grassroots leadership development in communities of color, low-income communities, I would say it's probably about half or a direct, and then as well through alliances, some additional portion.
All right, cool. Wow, this one's really different. Anyone else have a comment on how their own institution is doing on this? On correcting power imbalances? Wow, so 35% of us think that it's less than a quarter. You know, when we at NCRP talk about a funder as a serious social justice funder, that 25% threshold is what we use. If 25% or more is about building power and shifting power dynamics and building social justice and advocacy work, then we think they're a serious social justice funder if they're doing over a quarter. It's one of the benchmarks we use. Cool. Any thoughts on this distribution from this table over here?
I mean, that's nothing profound. I think it's,
Okay, all right, we'd like to shift it. Good, well that's a good segue to the next part of our conversation, which is what can we learn from some stories from our panelists about what's the right way to do this and what are the wrong ways to do this. And we've asked the funders on the panel to share stories of failure, things that didn't work, and when they did it wrong to try to shift power. And we've asked the grantees to talk about ways that it did work. Any volunteers to go first? Brad, kick us off.
Yeah, I love to talk about failure. So, you know, I cut my teeth on the late 80s to kind of mid-90s move to comprehensive community change initiatives supported by private foundations. And I actually managed one in West Oakland. And on a good day, I think that I failed in achieving what we were trying to achieve in terms of shifting power. And on a bad day, I kind of think that I violated the golden rule of do no harm. The reason I say that is that there were really two things that I thought really went awry in that work. First of all, West Oakland, some of you may have seen it in your site visits, but probably what you didn't get a chance to experience is that on the continuum of like neighborhoods, with one end being really kind of good politics and the other being funky politics, it falls on the funky politics level on side. And as a result, what we were trying to do was kind of organize a community around money and how that could be used in order to improve the community. And I have just concluded that the notion of organizing and shifting power in community by getting them to, in spirit, collaborate around how money should be spent, but in practice fight over how money should be spent, is not a way to shift power. And the other aspect of what we did was preceded the money spending phase of the initiative with a year of planning. And the planning process ended up being the accumulation of a laundry list of things that people wanted to see happen in their neighborhood, a fraction of which could actually be accomplished with the dollars that were being allocated. And so the other, what I would characterize as disempowering aspect of that work is to basically set an expectation and create a benchmark that was going to end in failure from the beginning. And so the two aspects of creating an unrealistic expectation in the beginning, but also the use of dollars in all the well-intended ways, in ways that undermine the power of community and allow people to work together toward common goals, were what I thought, those are lessons that have stuck with me in every job that I've had since then, in terms of things not to do. And so I'll stop there because I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but I just wanted to kind of share that because I think it has implications for all of us who think about ourselves as focused on power, but focused in on it from a place-based perspective and thinking about what that means.
Thank you. They need to shift the power dynamics of these, power of these chairs that are so incredibly high that we're all like, so it's interesting. I tried to think about this in sort of the failures. I don't necessarily, it's harder for me to think of like one grant that was a failure or whatnot. I think where I'm grappling with has to do with sort of broader dynamics and the impact as a grant maker, and particularly as one that moved from both being in the field to then being at a smaller grant maker with a lot of agency, and then to a larger grant maker. And some of the questions that on a national level, and so my funding, I work around issues of quality work and workers' rights, so how to improve the conditions, but also the power and voice of workers in the low-wage labor market to actually shift the terms of how the economy works for people, and particularly supporting an emerging field of organizations, of worker centers and other kinds of organizations. But my tools are mostly national in level, and so things that I am concerned about in terms of how they're playing out, whether they're failures or not, that I think happens in grant making. One of it has to do with this anointing that happens in philanthropy in an attempt to move resources in a smart way, but oftentimes it's sort of the opposite, I think, maybe if I understand of what you're talking about, redlining of resources. But in this way, as you're thinking about supporting emerging fields, Malkia a little bit ago talked about sort of the way in which philanthropy moves around personalities and around moments, rather than thinking about long-term sort of ecosystems and movements, and in an attempt to move resources the way in which we can anoint leaders, and both institutionally but also personalities, inadvertently or advertently, and right now, and that oftentimes has real both race and gender implications, and I think is really embedded in also sort of who we philanthropy know and are comfortable with, who therefore then we see as legitimate in a field and can deliver the outcomes, and then therefore where we're going to make big bets versus starving to eke out, sort of these are risks. So we'll give the risks these smaller pieces, but then they can't deliver, and so we're never, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that's problematic. And then finally, I'll just say the other thing that I think about a lot is we each have our theories of change, and we each have our strategies, and we're each going to build our field and our organizations. And then the field is having to do, and I think about this as we go into thinking about this new initiative around anchor institutions and build, where rather than thinking philanthropically with our partners and in our field, but also grantees, about how do we effectively resource the ecosystem we need, rather than I'm going to build the capacity of these fields alone as Ford. I'm going to do it as San Francisco Foundation. I'm going to do it as, and the unintended consequences, good intentions around capacity building, around organizational field building, but really does that end up where we want it to be? Are we anointing certain institutions? What kinds of institutions? Led by who? Made up by who? And how do we have those really, really tough conversations?
Sure. So, I talked about the founding of Color of Change, and the response in many ways was a technology, cultural, and political response that took the form of a single email to 1,000 people that our founders did that said, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the email was titled, "Kanye was right." And we don't send emails like that anymore because you never know what news cycle you're going to be in around Kanye West. So when people open their emails 3 or 4 days later and they're like, what is Color of Change talking about? I say that to say that email went out into the world, and over the next couple of years, Color of Change was able to build quite rapidly and quickly, taking on moments like Gina Six or Glenn Beck, and these moments where it was not the resources that Color of Change had. James Rucker was funding the organization in his home out of his own checkbook before we could get any foundation or major funder to support the organization. So it wasn't that funders came together and tried to create this movement infrastructure. It was that community created this movement infrastructure, and other donors like Wayne Jordan, Quinn Delaney, and other folks came along to support that idea and that vision. But we were also supported because our information traveled at the same speed as Fox News, as government, as all sorts of institutions that we were battling. And this week, we won a major victory. I know Malkia Ciro from Center for Media Justice was here, and other folks, but we won a major victory with net neutrality and protecting net neutrality at the courts. And that was an evolution of infrastructure that was built by funders. So this is a really positive story about how funders came together to support an infrastructure of diverse actors and advocates. They could have just supported sort of white-led, technology sort of driven institutions, wonks that were going to sort of go to Capitol Hill and describe the intricacies of net neutrality, but they funded a wide range of organizations. And at Color of Change, we have this sort of theory of change around our campaigns, that we respond to moments, we build, we then pivot to something systemic, and then we scale. So we have a respond, build, pivot, and scale model in terms of our campaign work. And funders really recognized that as we were responding to moments around Trayvon Martin, or Renisha McBride, or Michael Brown, or all these moments in the world, we were going to be able to, with our members, pivot to that systemic change around the information that we're putting out to the world can travel at the same speed. That if we're going to go up against MSNBC and tell them to fire Pat Buchanan because of his racist rants, that we're not going to be blocked because Comcast owns MSNBC and doesn't want our emails to get out into the world. And so we were able to communicate that. And between Ford Foundation with multi-year grants and Helen Bruner and the Media Democracy Fund, we were able to have the type of support that wasn't asking us every single day to send out an email about net neutrality, or every single day to shift our work to net neutrality, but recognize that we were representing a community. We were working to build long-term power, and we were going to consistently talk about the systemic ability of people to be heard, counted, and visible, regardless of whether they're privileged or vulnerable, majority or minority, and in the case of net neutrality, in favor or out of favor with those in power. And so to the extent that the ability to both have a field, to be able to show up to tables that were built and not just be the sort of black group that was going to be the brawn but not the brains, we were able to have the type of resources and infrastructure that could build internal support, build up staffing, and come to the table to represent the communities in ways that really not only made this win at the courts valuable, but when the courts made their decision, they said the internet is not a luxury. And that would have not happened if there were not communities, marginalized communities at the table, raising their voices, shifting the opinions of elected officials that represented our communities, holding accountable institutions from our communities that took telecom money and came out on the wrong side. If there were not our organizations, not just part of those coalitions, but leading those coalitions, that victory at the court would have looked very different.
So I think in terms of success stories, or at least in our experience, I'll get some of the expected elements out of the way, which have already been said, right? And I think one of the great things, and Laine hit on this, that is really great, and I think most of you all, if not all of you, fall into this category of funders, but program officers that see yourselves as organizers. And I think as groups that are seeking funding, we really need that partnership, but we need to know that you all do see yourselves as organizers, both organizing within your institutions, but also organizing, building coalitions and collaborations with other funders, because while we are organizing politicians, communities, we do see part of your all's role, and happy to hear that many of you see it as well, as organizing money, organizing funders, and that is really important for us. So the other elements, of course, for us, long-term funding is gold, right? I'm real commitment to organizations, institutions, movements, is important, and I'll come back and touch on at least a couple of these. Funding to field, critical, right? And I know many of much of philanthropy and foundations really moving towards funding networks, funding at the national level, and for us it's important that to the extent that that's happening, that money is actually flowing down to the field where the work happens. Because for us, and bias towards cities, like the work that is happening in cities, that is where we have a real impact. That is where models are created that can be replicated and we actually see change happen. In having a real partnership with funders for us is really key, and so that we can in fact have that dialogue and be vulnerable and kind of go through the challenges that we're facing and see how we can find solutions together. And then I'll just by way of example, we have been funded and supported by many of the foundations here in this room, and I think many of you do share all of those elements with us, and it's been critical to have your support. Through our campaigns, I can think of one where our ports campaign is now on its 10th year, right? And we've had, at least one funder who has seen us through the various phases of that campaign, through the highs and the lows, when we were losing and now that we're winning. And so it's really important that relationship, that relationship has endured. And then I'll just say this, the more and more that your grantees, and I speak from experience, are successful in contesting for power, in winning change, the more and more we are going to come under attack. And for us, it's been just we are immensely grateful that our funders have had our back all along the way, because we've had some not so flattering, articles in the press. There have been some controversial statements made about us, but it has been knowing that our funding for the next budget cycle was not at risk, has allowed us to take risks that we might not otherwise take, and so that's it's been really helpful.
Awesome. All right, so we had a whole bunch of more interactive stuff planned, and we are way behind schedule, so I'm going to get us back on schedule here. It's time to think about, what does this mean for you? I want people to leave this conference knowing, what are you going to do new, differently, the next week, the next month, the next year, to help your organization shift power to benefit underserved and marginalized communities? What can you do? And so to do that, you got to think about, what are my biggest obstacles and how am I going to overcome them? So I want you to turn to a partner at your table and in 3 minutes talk about what you're going to do while the panel thinks about their 30-second final thoughts that we'll get to at the end. So you've got 3 minutes. What are you going to do? Let's come back together. Jen, you want to share something you're going to do to shift power?
Yeah, I think for us, this gathering, for us at Humboldt Area Foundation, this gathering has been about finding our people and connecting to you to help. People in our region are hungry for this work, and we need partners to help feed that hunger. And so thank you for those of you who are helping the field bring power into the conversation about philanthropy.
Awesome. Any one other person to share what they're going to do? Somebody? Okay, over here. Great.
Hi, so one of the things that I talked about, it's small. It's something that I've already started to do, which is around language. So instead of referring to grantee organizations as our grantees, because I think that has like a paternalistic and kind of ownership, and we're talking about shifting power. That's a power dynamic in philanthropy and with grantee organizations, and just also asking questions. I don't want to assume I know what grantees are talking about whenever we're talking about building power and shifting that power. So talk to them and listen to what they have to say about that and let that inform my work.
Fantastic. Oh, all right, last one.
Jackie at the San Francisco Foundation with other colleagues from the San Francisco Foundation, and we had a really good conversation responding to, from the Ford Foundation, your comment about we put our big bets on the institutions that we're comfortable with and that we've worked with for a long time, and then we starve the smaller groups that we don't know as well or that we can't control or we don't have as long relationships with, and that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We're at a crossroads right now. The Foundation's going through a lot of changes and changing the way we do an open cycle versus proactive. And it really got a good conversation going on here about how when you don't do that open cycle, you lose the opportunities to get to know those new organizations that are so cutting edge when you're always relying on the groups you already know well. So thank you for that. It pushed us and it was good.
Right, all right. Closing thoughts, 30 seconds or less, each of our panelists. One thing you want people to walk away with.
So I'll try to keep this to 30 seconds. I've been around in these kind of conversations for many years now, and there are two conversations that we just never seem to get past, and they revolve around governance and structure. If I had a dime for every time somebody said, I want to do this, but my board won't let me, I'd be rich. And I understand where that comes from. We all want to keep our jobs. You don't want your board to think you're crazy. On the other hand, I just wonder sometimes how people in the positions who can manage boards do manage boards. And are we going into the room looking for approval, or are we going into the room looking for boundaries? And I think if you're going into the room all the time looking for approval, what you're doing is possibly psyching yourself out before you even get there around what your board will approve and what they won't approve. And so I would love to encourage everybody to kind of think about what it would look like to bring something into the room that is the risk of not being approved, so that you can see where the boundaries are, and then get a good feel for what you can do and what you can't do, rather than presuming what you can't do.
Awesome. That's great.
All right. Okay, two things. One thing that I was just sharing up here that I'm sitting with a lot is I think we need to be really rigorous with ourselves of who we give passes to and who we don't. And I think it goes a little bit to that, but someone recently said to a colleague of mine that she works at a very large global organization, multi-million dollar organization that over the last year has an entirely largely white male executive leadership, and has in the last 5 years only hired one African-American woman to their program team. And Ford has given them millions and millions of dollars over the last few years, and not one program person in those grants, although we have our diversity narrative and whatnot, said, what is going on? Really, what is going on? And then the way in which we give incredibly rigorous sort of examination to other kinds of organizations. Who do we give passes to for, okay, they have 20 free passes for not, for their, sort of not delivering on whatever, and then who do we give one pass and then they're out? And just being really rigorous and asking, why is this? The second thing I would just say, which is more of an inspirational one, is that I think, I love NFG. It is, for me, it is a home. It is about the connections here. But where I feel inspired coming out of here is, how do we actually move from more of a sharing to actually strategically aligning and grappling and thinking about the way in which we can aggregate our resources, broadly speaking, to make this impact? How do we really push beyond superficial collaboration to real deep alignment and collaboration together, as well as obviously with the partners in the field? Like, really push. What would that mean?
Awesome. Good challenge to the group.
So, well, no advice for you all. You all can advise each other on your role and the best way to fund and how to best organize. I will just say this as an organizer, as an advocate, as one of the leaders at Laine, that the work that you do, the funding you provide, has tangible impact on the ground. And so there is a lot at stake for you all, remembering again, like being values driven, and the impact of your work and the impact of your funding. In Los Angeles alone, and I'll speak for Laine, together with our partners in the last year, over 700,000 workers in Los Angeles got a raise through the minimum wage ordinance. That is huge, that is real, that is an impact that you all help to fund. After 10 years of organizing, we have at the ports of LA and Long Beach, the largest ports in the country, reduced emissions by over 90% from trucks. Again, all through your funding, real impacts on real lives and health. After 10 years, port truck drivers that have fought along environmental communities, 50 port truck drivers filed wage claims and won over $7 million in back wages through the Labor Commission. So again, something they never thought was possible, they won. We've been able to pass, what is comparable to ban-the-box policies at our largest public utility in Los Angeles. So again, all of these are real, tangible impacts that you all, in partnership with us and in partnership with all our allies, have helped bring about. So it's real, there's a lot at stake.
First of all, I want to thank NFG for having this conversation. I think it's incredibly important. In the last year and a half, I've been getting invited to more of these conversations from funders, an organization that's grown from uprising to infrastructure. And so my, less about advice, but more about push, is how do we get from these conversations to operationalizing it? I come into your rooms and say, hey, I have this idea, but you want me to operationalize it. And so how do we get to the operationalizing point around thinking about shifting power? And in these moments, as we are having conversations and looking at Black lives or immigrant lives, or we're thinking about how do we make LGBT people, and particularly the T, more powerful, how are we ensuring that we are not just funding people's pain, but funding people's power? Giving people to be the ability to not just see through the next couple of months or the next couple of years, but be able to see and build pathways that can actually deliver on people's needs, but more importantly, deliver on people's aspirations. And so at Color of Change, once again, I'm just going to leave you with this concept because we think about it through all of our campaign work. And as we continue to have to showcase our results on a day-to-day basis, because that's part of this work, we're thinking about every single day, how do you translate the presence that Black people have for us, but how do we translate the presence that all communities have into the actual power that changes written and unwritten rules, and not trick ourselves into awareness or conversation or anything else as a substitute for that. So thank you all.
Awesome. Please join me in thanking this fabulous panel.